So, today's speakers, I'll introduce them before we kick off with the presentation. Louise Potvin is currently professor at the Department of Social and Preventive Medicine at the School of Public Health at l'Université de Montréal and researcher at l'Institut de recherche en santé publique at l'Université de Montréal and at the Centre Léa Robach sur les inégalités sociales de santé de Montréal. She holds the Canada Research Chair in Community Approaches and Health Inequalities. Her main research interests are population health intervention research and the role of social environments in the local production of health and health equity. In addition to having edited and co-edited 8 books, Dr. Potvin has published more than 260 peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, editorials, and comments. She is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Public Health. Nazim Muhajirin is director of the Saskatchewan Population Health and Evaluation Research Unit and senior editor of the Canadian Journal of Public Health. His motto, Think Globally, Act Locally, guides his research and has led him to focus on projects that locally address widespread social issues, such as how income-based social inequality can affect health. Dr. Muhajirin's projects often bring together a diverse range of academics and off-campus partners to tackle complex longitudinal studies on socially pressing issues. Involving decision makers early and often is a central tenet of his research process. He has been involved on more than 80 grants and contracts throughout his career, and his research programs have attracted millions of dollars from a wide range of funding agencies. So before we kick off with the presentations, we just hope to get a better sense of who is in the audience. So we have a couple of polls, 4 polls. If you could please check what is most applicable in terms of where you're at with your education and training. Okay, so a lot of graduate and PhD and a couple postdocs and 1 or 2 people with professional degrees. Thank you. Now, what is your primary role? Are you currently a student? So a bit of a mix between students and early career researchers. Okay, thank you. Just a couple more. Have you ever published in a peer-reviewed journal? Yes, no, unsure. Okay, looks like the majority have published. And what about prior experience as a peer reviewer, specifically for quantitative articles? So there's a fairly even split between people with prior experience and people without. Thank you. That gives our presenters useful background information about who is in the audience. Without further ado, I will hand things over, including the controls, to Louise Potvin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you very much, people, for being there. I'm happy that most of you have already published, so that qualifies you as a peer from my perspective of a editor-in-chief. And I would strongly encourage you to get into the CJPH database, identify yourself, and maybe leave just a little note that you're willing to do peer review. That, of course, will help my work and that of Nazim and that of the other editors of Canadian Journal of Public Health. Here is what we will be covering with this. webinar, I'm going to take care of the first part, and I will leave the second part to my colleague Nazim, whose main role with the journal is exactly that, to handle peer review of quantitative articles. I just want to start with this, which was a monument celebrating the unlikely hero, the anonymous peer reviewer. This was posted in The Guardian, and it was in Moscow in 2017. I just want to underscore the fact that this monument is in the form of a dice with various outcome depending on how it lands. As an editor-in-chief, I hope, and my role is to make sure that this is not the case, that peer review is not random. It is somewhat subjective, and the role of the editorial board of a journal is to ensure fairness of the process and, as much as possible, transparency and formative, in the sense that peer review should be a way as well to improve science. So, what should you do peer review for journals? The first reason is really to help ensure quality research is published. Peer review is not a flawless process. We've all, since you've all published, you all know the frustration of having the impression that the reviewers have not totally understood what your paper was about, the high quality of your work. But it is an iterative process. Science is an iterative process. There is not much discovery in science that go from a totally revolutionary perspective. We build on each other's work, and essentially, the validity of the scientific process rests on the peer review, and being part of this process is ensuring your role for you in the scientific community. It allows to see new research before it is published. So it is a way to know, to get informed of what is being worked on in your community. Eventually, the editor know their pool of reviewers, and essentially they send them papers that are in their specific area of expertise, and this allows the reviewers really to get really a sneak preview of what is going to appear in the literature. But of course, it is confidential. This is a process that is regulated by the editorial team of a journal, and as such, everything that you get in the peer review process is confidential. This is something as well that is a sign of recognition in your field. This is something that you put in your CV in the early career and at the stage of graduate students. The number and the prestige of journals in which you are acting as peer reviewer is certainly something that address the issue of recognition. Of course, it's also a responsibility. If you are publishing in a journal, it's because someone has reviewed your paper. So there's a reciprocity in our community, and that kind of generosity is also expected to make the field move and to ensure the quality of the scientific process. Career advancement, it is expected in academia and is seen as a contribution. We work hard and this is also part of our job, to make sure that university recognize this aspect of your work and service to the community. And finally, it's a contribution to science. I just want to say a little word here about predatory journals. Our field has been increasingly at risk of being trapped by predatory journals. These are journals that don't want necessarily to contribute to science. Essentially, their business model is to publish whatever is submitted to them and for a price. There are there are self-regulation about that, but the the idea is really to screen the journals that you publish in, and to ensure that uh, they have legitimacy, and that your work is going to be well taken care of. So, what happens when an article is submitted to CJPH? Well, it first comes to my desk, and at CJPH, since we've migrated our production with a professional publisher, which is Springer, we are now receiving. Last year, we've received about 500 manuscripts. So, which means essentially, do the math, 10 per week. And we publish more or less 100 articles per year. So, again, do the math, it's about 20%. So, in order to to ensure that the editors who are handling the peer review and reviewers and authors are not overwhelmed and the delays are not too long. That's one part of my job, is to be able to foresee and to screen out what is not going to be finally accepted. So more or less, 75% of the papers that we receive, that I screen, are screened out, and the rest, 25%, are sent for peer review. Then, when I decide that there is potential for a paper, I assign it to a senior editor. And then the senior editors whose specialty is in the realm of this paper, in the domain of the paper. And again, it may happen that I do not make the screening decision myself. I will consult with some editors in order to make sure that I made the right screening decision. But I would say that most of the screening is at my level, and then I assign a senior editor to handle the peer review. The senior editor again reviews the manuscript. He or she may send it back to me, with a little note. What did you think sending this? This has been known for 20 years. Or they will not reply and send it to potential reviewers. Then potential reviewers are selected based on their expertise and the manuscript topic. So this flowchart tells you really what happens. So manuscript is received. There's a decision there to be sent to a senior editor, who check it for scope and quality again, and that then it can still be rejected at that point. And when the editor is happy with the potential for a paper, then she select up to two reviewers. And actually, with the erosion of the censor responsibility, with the pressure on times, with also some journals who are paying their peer reviewers because they are open access, and they charge for uh, for papers for authors to publish in those journals. So there it is it has been increasingly difficult to find good quality peer review. It may happen that we have to solicit and invite up to 8, 10, 12 reviewers to ensure that we have proper quality peer review for a paper. Then the role of the editor, senior editor, is really to consolidate those reviews and ensure that they are quality peer review. If she is not happy with that, she may solicit another reviewer or get more deeply involved in the peer review, him or herself. Depending on the decision, it could be minor revision, then it's not going to go to peer review again. If it's major revisions, then usually we ensure that the paper goes back to at least one reviewer, one of the original reviewer, if possible, so that they can have a look of the work that has been done with the paper. And of course, the paper can still be rejected at that point as well. So this is really the peer review cycle, how it gets in and how it gets out. How we select reviewers. We have a database of reviewers with research interest, expertise, and these indications are usually self-selected and by the reviewers themselves. We also have colleagues in our expertise area, and we populate this database as well based on our own network. And of course, we check the reference list in papers and PubMed to see who's publishing in this area. So the moment you get into the publication business, meaning having one of your paper published, you're on the radar screen of editors who will or may ask you to do peer review because, as implied in the term publication, your work becomes public. So at CJPH, we required 2 reviewers for every manuscript, on average about 5 review requests, but sometimes we do way more than that. For our quantitative and as well for our qualitative research paper, we have double-blind review. Means that the reviewer does not know who the author is, and the authors do not know who the reviewers are. And this is believed to ensure fairness. But I can tell you as well that in our section that is mostly dedicated to practitioners, we do open peer review, meaning that both the authors and the reviewers know exactly who's doing what, and we even allow correspondence between them, which is refereed by the senior editor taking care of that section, but in a capacity building. So when the reviews comes in, the senior editor decides whether to recommend to accept the manuscript. It rarely happens, to revise the manuscript or decline the submission. The revised manuscript then goes to the authors, and then we ask the authors to revise manuscript and the authors to respond to reviewer comments, itemize them, and revise the manuscript as requested by the authors and resubmit. So essentially, a resubmission is a detailed answer to each comment and a manuscript that is corrected accordingly. So when you're asked to review an article, you need to ask yourself a few questions. The first question is, do I have the necessary expertise? Is it in my field? Can I fairly assess the quality of this piece of work. The second question, of course, is do you have a potential conflict of interest? Obviously, you do not have the name of the person, but sometimes you can recognize the work of people you will know. In that case, I would say a proper course of action is to reply to the editor and saying, well, I think I recognize this work. It is that of such and such, and I feel that I'm in conflict. And then the editor will answer back saying, no, you're not in conflict, and then you can proceed. Or, yes, thank you for indicating the potential conflict. The third question is, do you have the time to review within the requested deadline? Of course, and this is true for all of us, we want our work published in reasonable delay. We are not really happy when our own work sits unanswered for months and months. So as a reviewer, it is really graciousness to do the same for the manuscripts that are coming your way. So if you cannot submit within the requested deadline, then you cannot. But you can as well request for extensions. And given, the duration of extension that you're asking for, and where we are in the review process, it is generally granted. And then it is as well just polite to accept or decline the invitation and answer to this email. So once you've accepted to review for CJPH, then comes the issue of quality, and Nazim will continue with specific comments for quantitative peer review articles. Nazim?
Great. Thank you very much, Louise. Very well. I would like to leave enough time for us to have Q&A session. So I'll take the next 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes to walk you through what a good peer review represents, and also to help address questions along with Louise. Okay, so there is a review form that you would receive if you accept to review a paper, and this review form is a standardized form, and it has questions starting with introduction, different sections of the paper with introduction, methods, and so on. Each question is a close-ended response alternatives. Three alternatives: yes, improvement required, or no. And we expect the reviewer to address each and every question as you read through the paper and then fill out the form. This is a very important standardized form. And of course, we expect that you will give a narrative comments on the paper that you're reviewing in separate pages. So I just want to talk about here about some general comments of a peer review. It is important to start your review with a short summary of the manuscript. Why is this important? This is important so that you are communicating to your author that you have understood the main focus, the aim of the paper. In a way, you are showing some accountability to the author that you have understood the main focus of the paper. And if you are actually on the other side, if you are the author and you would want to have confidence of your reviewer, that he or she had understood the main focus of the paper. So this is where a summary statement could be very helpful. It is always useful to indicate any strengths of the paper before you get into the weakness. Strengths of the paper communicates to the author that they are doing things well, that we want to encourage this. This is how science strengthens and advances. So we want to make sure that strengths are highlighted as well. Of course, limitations and concerns will represent most of your comments. But before that, you would want to say something about the strengths of the paper. One of the very important considerations is to ask the question of yourself when reviewing the paper. Does the question on which the paper is focused on has merit to advance science? Does it address important gaps or controversies? Does it actually take a stand on a controversy or inconclusive area of research? And if this paper was published, would it measurably actually advance science? That's a very important question to ask yourself. And also in the early goings of almost screening the paper, you want to ask the question, is this paper has potential for publication? If it was given an opportunity to revise and resubmit, could it actually proceed to publication? Is there a reasonable chance that it could get published? If you answer your question that no, it does not have a chance of publication, even with any revisions, even substantial revisions, then you'd want to indicate that to the editor right away. So a good review should be these points. These are some hallmarks of a well-done review. But some things to keep in mind. I would say that you want to review the work that has been presented to you, not necessarily the study that you would have designed and presented. This is not your study that you are reviewing. You're reviewing somebody else's study. And I think you want to meet the author, on the basis of the study that was done and presented, not necessarily the study that you would do. So that's an important frame to keep in mind when you are reviewing a paper. I would also say to avoid generalities and hyperbole. Always be specific, precise, so the author can respond also with precision and specificity, when they're revising and resubmitting the paper. Avoid saying, for example, things like, make statements like, discussion need to be strengthened. That is not a very specific nor precise statement, but instead, you may want to say in what ways or in which areas or points that the discussion need to be strengthened in this paper. A lot of reviewers have the question about how long a review should be. As a general rule of thumb, as a bit of a guide, I would say 2 to 3 pages, 2 pages, single space, kind of typewritten. This will be the narrative part of your review comments. And we like to see each of the comments itemized as much as possible, drawing the attention of the author to the specific text. In other words, the place in the manuscript which you are referring to and you are commenting on. When the article is numbered on the left margin, this is very easy to do. So you indicate page number 2, line 34 is where you're commenting on in that specific comment that you're making. So as much as possible, specificity and precision is important. So the next 3 or 4 slides takes each of the section one at a time, and I'm not going to go through this item by item. I think you could read this and understand. But I will actually, in this slide, I will make the comment that it is really important, critically important, to ask yourself, is the study objective or the question stated precisely and in a manner that it can be empirically tested? And I think that is a very important consideration to make. Keep in mind that the study questions or the aims, as you read along the rest of the paper, and at the end of the paper, you should ask yourself whether the study question or the objectives have been answered completely and that these have been attained. So it's really important to ask yourself and have that frame in your mind. What is this study about, and has the study questions and objectives been met at the end? Moving on to the next slide on methods and including ethical considerations. This is where a lot of the detail of your paper that you're reviewing will be presented. The nuts and bolts of the methods. And I would say for a paper in CJPH, you want to keep in mind that the method section is not overwrought. It's not overly long. Neither it is, a summary statement, or it is too short, in other words. So it is sort of like the Goldilocks effects. Not too much, not too little, just right. Enough detail in the method section for someone who is reading the paper to understand what methods were used, as well as if that person wants to replicate the study using the methods that was presented, that they have enough information to do so. I think you want to pay particular attention to some key variables or classes of variables. Outcome. Is the outcome clearly defined, delineated, and described? What are the exposure variables? Have they been defined and clearly described? And what are the key confounders or modifiers? And again, are they clearly defined and described? These days, increasingly, we see manuscripts that are using data collected using really cutting-edge technology, for example, wearable devices, sensing devices, etc. So if you happen to be reviewing a paper that uses this kind of very new technology for data collection, you need to be vigilant that these new assessment methods are well described and they are well referenced, and that again they can be replicated by a researcher who's reading the study. These kinds of technologies and data collected through technologies usually have masses of data, huge amount of data. So you want to pay particular attention to the analysis section, and to make sure that the analysis describe well the analytical method taken for in analyzing the data. Ethical considerations are very important. If you don't see any statement regarding ethical approval, or that if ethical approval is not needed, that there's a statement regarding to that effect is there. If not, this is something that you want to flag for the editor. Moving on to results and discussion sections of the paper. In terms of results, this is where you actually get the answers to the questions that the study was hoping to address. First of all, you also want to know that the participants as a group are understood. You could actually understand, reading the paper, who the study participants were, and that they are described well. Are each of the questions or even hypotheses, if there are any hypotheses, being addressed with the results presented? In the discussion and the conclusion sections, did the authors address their research questions? Is there a summary statement or paragraph at the beginning of the discussion that sort of summarizes what the questions were and what the answers to those questions were before they go on to position this study in relation to the literature at large? Are limitations being noted? Are strengths being highlighted? These are some of the things that you would want to be looking for in the discussion. And is there a concluding paragraph or concluding section of the paper that you could see? Okay, just a few more slides here. I was mentioning that not to get into general statements, and so here's a general statement or weak comment might be the results are poorly presented. But rather, what we like to read in the comments are something to the effect, the author stated that the dropout rate was 5%, but the figure 145 shows that people started smoking cessation. 145 people started the smoking cessation program, but only 104 of them were completed it, suggesting that dropout rate was actually 28%. So that kind of a comment is more constructive, more informative, and that is a type of a comment that the author can respond to in their revisions. So this is an example of a general comment that we don't want to see, but rather a more specific comment that we like to see. Evaluating the manuscript's readability. When you're reading through the paper, you would come across the readability, the flow of the manuscript, as well as the sentence structure, spelling, grammar, all of those issues. You could make a statement in your comment to the editor that there are some of these issues, but you don't have to fix them for the author. You could flag them, but you don't really need to fix these issues, structural issues of the paper. This will be done by the author, him or herself. So there are instances when the paper that you're reviewing is actually very well written and presented. It's a good study, very well presented, and you feel like there's not a whole lot of critical comments to make in this case. And sometimes these type of papers are more difficult to critically comment on because there's not much to say. If that is the case, we would like to hear from you why you think this is an excellent paper. And you may actually end up saying more positive and complimentary comments about the paper rather than critical comments. And these are, again, still a helpful review for us and you might actually end up recommending the paper in a positive way. Some general tips then when you are doing a review. Very important, do not include comments to the author about whether the manuscript should be published. Your job as a reviewer is to comment in detail where the paper could be improved, where the paper has got things right, and not so much write in the body of the review any comment about whether it should be published or not. There is a menu, drop-down menu, where you could make a recommendation, but not necessarily in the body of the paper. And another point to remember, very important, is that this is a privilege exercise, a privilege task that you are asked to do on behalf of science and the journal. And therefore, everything that you read, that you have access to, is confidential until, of course, if the paper is published. And this information is not to be shared with anyone or used for any purposes other than what it was intended, and that is for you to review the paper. So your comments are being sent to your peers, just as you would have received comments from your peers when you are the author, and just as you would not necessarily appreciate impolite or rude comments, it is keep in mind that all comments need to be polite and done in a professional manner. There is a place in the review in the windows where you can make a comment directly to the editor, and where you will make comments in the nature of if there's any fatal flaws, issues with ethics, or any plagiarism. So if you recognize texts that you have seen somewhere else, this is a place that you could directly indicate to the editor, and only the editor will be seeing these comments, not the author. So it's important to make use of this facility in the review. And over to you, Luis.
Yeah, maybe just a few notes in conclusion. So as I was saying previously, the peer review process is highly imperfect, but it remains the least biased way in which science can both be conservative, not to go with the flavor of the month. And we've all seen the lay press getting totally out of their mind with preliminary results that turned out not to be significant and replicable. So that's our role as peer reviewers to ensure that the science remains valid while being as well innovating. And this is the major role of peer review. I also reiterate that it's a sign of recognition in one's field, and you build your reputation as peer reviewers as well, and that it is something to indicate in an academic CV. I want to reiterate the importance of having many detailed and informative assessments for each paper. Each reviewer has its own perspective on a paper. Each reviewer will have their specific lens, and it's really the critical role of the editor to ensure that the reviews are complete and that they are made in a way that will improve the readability of the paper. And in CJPH, we have this process by which reviewers as well learn about the other reviews when everything has been completed. So this is also a way to learn about the quality of one's peer review. And I would end all this by saying that it is an important way in which one learn how to write good papers as well. And I would certainly encourage those of you who still have a supervisor, though who are still in research in the role of a student, of a graduate student, to ask your supervisor uh, to uh, to supervise your peer review work. I'm sure she is regularly solicited and invited to do peer review. Like all of us, she is probably saying no to a lot of them, not for lack of interest, but for lack of time. And I personally coach my students to do peer review because I think that this is something that you acquire. And when I do that, whenever I do that, I'm very transparent with the editor who's asked me to do that, and I tell the editor that this review's been done by this and this, who's a graduate student of mine who has published in such and such, and eventually that's a way to get into the peer review process oneself. So thank you very much for your attention, for being there. We will answer questions now. Emma?
Terrific. Thank you so much to you both. We do have a few questions, and I would urge the participants to post your questions now if you haven't done so on the chat box. There's a question about the time frame for peer review and how long a reviewer can have in general to respond to the form.
In CJPH at this time, and we use the default option of Springer, our publisher, it's 3 weeks. So, but again, we give people 1 week to answer the request for review, and then 3 weeks to perform the peer review. This is reasonable, but we're very flexible for ask for extension, demand for extension.
Okay, thank you.
I would also say very quickly that as soon as you get an invitation to review, it is appreciated that you could respond quickly, not wait for 7 days. For example, if you're going to do the review, respond quickly to the invitation. And if you are not able to do the review at that particular time, occasion, rather than saying just no, we would like to know why you are saying no at that time. This is useful information to editors.
And I would add to that useful information as well. If you know someone who could perform the review, whom you know, and suggest reviewers' names to the editor, that's also quite appreciated.
Good suggestion. We have a couple of questions from Christine, who is wondering if you can only be a reviewer in a journal where you have already published, and whether you have to renew your expression of interest to be a reviewer on an annual basis.
The answer is no to both questions. And as I said, of course, from the moment that you published a paper as first author in the Canadian Journal of Public Health, you're part of our database for reviewers because you're a peer. So you are in our database. So you're definitely more likely to be selected and to be invited to do peer review in a journal where you publish. But since your work is out there in database and PubMed database, so you can be invited by other journals. Usually, no, you do not have to renew your willingness to review on a yearly or any regular basis. What happens is once we've got many no's from a single individual and decline to review, then we may just drop these people out of our data.
And just logistically speaking, if you were to change a position, where you work, and have a different email address, that will be a time that you'd want to write to CJPH and let people know that you have new contact information, so that you could continue to be considered for PR.
Thanks. Well, you certainly sparked a few questions from me. So if I may, while others might be trying to formulate their own questions, maybe I'll just ask one or two. I'm wondering, when it comes to a paper being accepted or rejected, are there any trends in terms of where there are major hangups? Is it in the methods section? We hear all that often when looking at review of grants, for example, that the reviewers are usually very focused on the methods and find some flaws in there. What about when it comes to manuscripts? Is there anything that you can say about, the papers that tend to get rejected because they're weak in a certain area versus other papers?
I would say, first of all, papers are screened out essentially because they are out of scope. Okay, so that happens. I would say that 30-35% of the paper that I reject and that I screen out are out of scope, meaning to clinical health services research. I reiterate that CASPER is a very good journal. It's healthcare policy. So if your work is more in terms of health services research, you may want to submit your papers to CASPER, to healthcare policy. So out of scope is one reason to be screened out. The idea is, does the database that is being analyzed allow the authors to answer the questions accept at the end of the introduction? If yes, if it's an interesting and timely question, an editor may be very, very patient with in terms of back and forth. I've seen 3-4 revisions because it was a good database. Obviously, it was the work of someone who was not used to publication, and there was quite a bit of back and forth, and it ended up being a good paper because the database was good, the question was good, and the authors were responsive to comments, and it took time. What is usually a termination, and that's not the right word, situation is when the editor at one point realized that the author will not be in a position to answer the queries that were made that were legitimate, and or that the database at the end of the day will not allow proper answer to this question. Maybe Nazim, you have something to add to that?
No, actually, not terribly kind of new to what you had already said. The paper never gets rejected because the introduction was weak. I mean, that I could say that. It is the case that it could get rejected after being screened, being within scope of the journal, of interest to the journal and the readership. It could get rejected because the data could not answer the questions, or there was the question to be answered. The question is not, specific enough. And in spite of being asked to clarify the question, the authors are not able to do so. And I think those are the reasons that would typically, after being screened in, that will lead to a rejection. It's a good question, Emma, that you put to us, but it is a fundamentals. It's a good question. Can the data answer the question? Has it been properly answered? Has it been situated in relation to the rest of the literature? If it is yes to all those questions, usually it gets accepted.